Hello everyone, welcome once again to Reading Culture. In the last video, we began looking at a tale from one of the 20th century's most famous writers, J.R.R. Tolkien. A tale involving a plucky, young, well, somewhat young, humble hero and a fierce dragon. And where we left off, the hero of our story was about to confront this dragon. And no, we were not talking about The Hobbit. We were talking about Farmer Giles of Ham, right? A short story by Tolkien that originally arose out of a story that he told to his children. And eventually he made it more sophisticated, right? A lot more philological jokes involving languages, Latin and what have you, and history for an older audience, and perhaps made it more satirical as well. And we're certainly going to see in a moment how the confrontation with the dragon, of course, is not going to play out like it would in a traditional story. Indeed, in a traditional fairy story, of course, the confrontation between the hero and the dragon, or the hero and whatever the creature or foe is in the particular tale, right, is usually an opportunity for the character to learn something about themselves, particularly if the story is such that it is about a humble or inexperienced character learning what they are capable of, and relying on their wits. Or so, if we want to think about the Hobbit, for instance, in Bilbo's confrontation with Smaug the dragon in the Lonely Mountain, right, we see him relying not only on his invisibility that he gets from the ring, and not even on his general kind of sneakiness, but also on his wits, right? His ability to riddle with the dragon, and survive in that way. What we're going to get in Farmer Giles of Ham is not going to quite be that, right? Because of the nature of the tale, particularly in this version, which is again somewhat satirical. At the very least, it's having fun with the conventions of the traditional fairy story, and particularly in regards to dragon confrontations. So we're not necessarily going to see Farmer Giles uh, react, perhaps, in the way that we might expect. So if you recall, he was really uh, forced to set out in search of the dragon. It wasn't particularly intent upon actually finding him. So if we look at the point of the story where he finally confronts the dragon, right? We see that he stumbles upon him completely by accident, right? It is not a planned interaction at all. And we get an initial bit of conversation, right? We could maybe see a bit of comparison between, say, Bilbo and Smaug, insofar as, right, the dragon starts talking with him. And it soon becomes clear that Crucifylax, the Rich, right, who's the dragon, is going to try and trick him, right, get him talking, and then when he's not looking, pounce on him. And that's precisely what he tries to do. And it seems that Giles, if he had indeed been relying simply upon his own wits, would have been devoured. But he is saved at the last minute by Tailbiter. So remember, Tailbiter is the sword given him by the king that turns out is this legendary sword owned by a legendary hero, and seems to have a mind of its own. And it essentially saves Giles, right? It kind of shoots forward and causes the dragon to recoil. And Giles, interestingly, having been quite timid up to this point, having been saved by his magic sword, right? At that point, of course, he seems to be quite brave, right? Telling the Giles, "You can take yourself off, you horny old varmint." So Giles, also hoping to escape battle, "I only want to be shot of you. Go right away from here and get back to your own dirty den." He stepped towards Crucifylax, waving his arms as if he were scaring crows, right? So we get a sense that uh, it's perhaps less his kind of innate courage than it is him relying upon the sword. Uh, this then leads to a rather humorous scene with the dragon being pursued by the mayor, well, by Giles on the mayor. So right, closing in on him. But there's a sense that the mayor is actually the bravest one here, um, it doesn't seem to have any timidity about pursuing a dragon, which is something and to keep in mind the importance of the gray mare as the story goes on. So they pursue the dragon over hill and dale until finally it's tuckered out and it's sitting panting, in fact, by the village. And indeed, not only panting, but begging for its life. So here we're going to see the dragon trying to buy them off, right? Offering them payment in order to save itself. So again, we have a somewhat interesting scene where it is the dragon, trying to use its cunning to trick people. But there's a humorous element that's added to it because here we have this dragon bartering very much like they're in a marketplace with the simple townspeople who are believing what he's trying to say. So there is a sense, though, that maybe not all of the villagers are quite so gullible. So the basic premise of this scene is that the dragon is offering to pay them treasure if he's let go, but of course, what if the dragon doesn't come back? Uh, so the blacksmith, despite his dour nature, actually has the most sense in the scene, where he says, "No good will come of it, mark my words. A worm," that's the word for a dragon, "won't return. Say what you like, but no good will come of it either way. You can stand out of the bargain if that's your mind," they said to him, and went on haggling, taking little further notice of the dragon. So here you see this kind of play on the foolishness again of the villagers, haggling with the dragon and not understanding the potential for deception. But again, it's also a kind of unheroic climax to this, The dragon is chased down, but instead of being slain, or even perhaps bested in a battle of wits, like a riddle game, instead it turns into a somewhat comical game of haggling. All right, so the deal is nevertheless reached, The dragon will pay such and such a sum in order to be let free, and he's to come back on the 14th of January, the feast day of Saints Felix and Hilarion, to return with the treasure to pay for his freedom and his life. We get a joke on the profession of the author, So Tolkien is was a professor of English, He was a philologist, so he dealt with grammar and etymology and what have you. And we're going to see him kind of injecting his own profession in a kind of amusing way in the text, where we see the parson enter in and described as a grammarian. It says he was a grammarian and could doubtless see further into the future than others. So there's a sense that Tolkien is similar to the foreword, is having fun with the fact that, so just like he wrote the foreword, very much poking fun at the kind of pompous writing of some academics and scholars, So here he's having fun with this idea that grammarians know more than everyone else. He also has a joke about the same point with regards to the blacksmith, who, learning that it's on the feast of Saints Hilarius and Felix that the dragon should return, says the blacksmith shook his head and went back to his smithy. "Ominous names," he said, "Hilarious and Felix. Don't like the sound of them." So again, another joke on language. So Felix means happy. Think of felicitous, and hilarious sounds like hilarious. So but they're ominous with the blacksmith, who of course only likes dour things. But things will be ominous after a fashion, as we will see. So the king comes to learn of this whole situation, and we see the entry of the king into Ham, who proceeds to claim all of the treasure for himself, as he is their lord, And so, as their liege, that's to say, their feudal lord, their lord to whom they owe fealty, loyalty, the villagers have to yield up to him all the treasure that they get. Though the king says that, well, he'll reward, of course, them in some way. We also, though, get a sense of one of the more satirical kind of elements of the story and more humorous elements, which is that, of course, the main character, the main heroic character, is this simple farmer. We haven't seen much of knights thus far. Well, when we do see them, we see that they're not exactly perhaps what you would expect. So, for instance, we see them described as right, the knights were talking among themselves about the new fashion of hats. Right, so there's a sense that the knights are more worried about fashion than they are about fighting. So again, there's a kind of comment on the fact that the kind of onus of heroic responsibility has fallen on this yeoman farmer, Farmer Giles. So the king pitches his tent and waits for the dragon to return. And once again, the real knights seem to only be worried about food. So they're not exactly striking a very heroic figure here. So the king he pays the people with funds that he doesn't actually have. His exchequer is broke. So again, we get the sense of right. The king is he's a broke king. And we're going to see throughout how a lot of the responsibility that should fall in other places, right? The knights that should be protecting the people but aren't, right? The king that should be able to provide for the people but cannot, right, is going to fall on others. And that might be important to think about with regards to Giles's decisions later on. So, the dragon, unsurprisingly, does not show up, right? Just as the blacksmith indicated that he would not, right? And as we, as a reader, are probably not surprised to learn. The villagers apparently are. So, and indeed, the king is as well. He responds by writing, right in the hand of the court, a warrant for the arrest of the dragon. And again, we get another amusing list of his legal violations for which this warrant is being issued. This is, of course, fairly absurd, the idea that you would write a warrant for a dragon and accuse him of, various legal violations, but that's part of the humor of right, of the story, these kinds of incongruous things. Farmer Giles ultimately has to set off with the knights to get the dragon, and right, blacksmith, as usual, of course, thinks that right, he's never going to return. He gets to the court, Giles does, barely in time to have a piece of bread and wine before he has to set off with all these knights in search of the perfidious dragon. And there's a sense that he's out of place amongst the general throng of knights, and we're going to see how his reaction indeed is going to be quite different from the rest of them. Although the mayor is going to play a very important part in that as well. The mayor is loaded down with baggage for the journey. He soon goes lame. Right, and is quite tired out. That could or will play into the ultimate confrontation. So, after much traveling, this retinue on the Feast of Candlemas on February 2nd. Yesterday, if you're watching this, the day that it's posted, they come upon the dragon. And Tailbiter, of course, if you recall, right within 3 miles of dragons, it leaps out of its sheath, and the dragon bounds out of its cave unexpectedly. Again, there's another joke about making fun of these kinds of courtly rules that the knights are perhaps overly bound to, right? So there's a note about the dragon's lack of warning or formality in attacking the knights, and how basically the joke is that it goes utterly against the etiquette of chivalry. But of course, the dragon is strangely indifferent to this, and so the dragons are scattered, or the dragon rather scatters the knights, right? Some of them are killed, some of them are thrown off in the ditch, some of them run away, or their horses flee and they flee with them. But the appearance of Farmer Giles, who it's clear would have probably run away, except for the sturdy mare, who apparently had enough sense to realize that no good outrunning a dragon, and decided to simply stand her ground. And this gives the dragon pause, right? And it ultimately leads Giles to try and coerce the dragon without tricks to turn over all the treasure, right? So the point of kind of make or break is in some ways decided by the horse. So the dragon tries to bargain to keep some of his treasure in consideration of an immediate cash payment. Right? The idea is that, well, if I pay you now in cash, right, I should be able to keep some of this. Again, getting that kind of incongruous interjection of a modern economic credit, right? The idea that, oh, if I pay in cash now, I'll save money. So that, again, it's a deliberately humorous reference because it doesn't fit with the world, right? And so we find it funny. But Giles will not have it, right? So they chaffer, that is, they haggle, they bargain, again, as though it were a market fair. So we saw this earlier, this kind of bargaining with the dragon and the idea of the kind of simple villager being fooled. But here we get a sense of perhaps one of the main virtues of Farmer Giles is that he is a cagey and a prolific haggler, and that this peasant skill, in this case, is actually being put to a seemingly heroic end by overcoming the dragon in his bargaining. So ultimately, the dragon does go back into its hall. Right? There's this grand hall that is described. Um, the doors of this deep house were set wide, and in their shadow they halted. So far, Chrysophylax had no chance to escape, but coming now to his own gate, he sprang forward and prepared to plunge in. Right, so there's a sense of that dragons use the halls of giants or men of old. Right, they don't build their own, but they're always these grand halls, very much like you see in The Hobbit and even in Beowulf. When you get to Beowulf, we see a more serious version of this. We also start to see a change in Giles' character or personality a bit. So we see that while the mayor does seem to be also very confident, right? It says, right, so the mayor sniffed. She could not imagine Farmer Giles going down alone into a dragon's den for any money on earth. So she knows that Farmer Giles isn't going to go in. But what about Farmer Giles himself? Um, but Chrysophylax is quite prepared to believe it, with Tailbiter looking so bright and sharp and all. Right. So again, there's this also sense of Tailbiter being the real threat here. Maybe he was right, and the mare, for all her wisdom, had not yet understood the change in her master. Farmer Giles was backing his luck, and after 2 encounters was beginning to fancy that no dragon could stand up to him. Right, so even though there is this sense that luck does seem to be with him, there is also the sense that Giles is starting to believe his own legend. Right, he's starting to believe that actually this dragon should be afraid of him, and he can handle it quite easily. But regardless of his actual ability, the dragon does actually cough up the treasure. Not only that, but the dragon is now forced at this point to carry the treasure back for Farmer Giles. Now, there's an important scene here in all of this, where it notes that so this haggling has gone back and forth, and it's gotten to the point where, because Farmer Giles had initially said, you have to give all of the treasure to me, but the dragon says, well, okay, hang on, right? What if I just give you most of it and I carry it back for you, but I can still keep a little bit to keep me respectable? So again, another joke, the idea of just like an English, gentleman needs a certain amount of money to be respectable in society. So that is with dragons, right? To be respectable, you have to have some gold in your hall. And so they're haggling in this way. It says, then the farmer took out a toothpick with his left hand, and he thought very hard for a minute. Then done with you, he said, showing a laudable discretion. A knight would have stood out for the whole horde and got a curse laid upon it. We're going to see a cursed horde in Beowulf. And as likely as not, if Giles had driven the worm to despair, he would have turned and fought in the end, tailbiter or no tailbiter, in which case Giles, if not slain himself, would have been obliged to slaughter his transport and leave the best part of his gains in the mountains. Right? So there's this sense that Giles does show a certain amount of kind of virtue of prudence here. He does not give in to avarice, by at least it seems. I mean, he's still obviously asking for gold, but he does not demand the very last of the gold. And this is significant. So there's a potential kind of reference here to the idea of the cursed figure, cursed by gold. So in Old Norse mythology, for instance, we have the tale Regnsmal, in which Loki, right, god of mischief, forces this dwarf Andvari he catches him in a net and forces him to spend all of his gold to ransom his way out. And ultimately, he takes his very last possession, which is a ring, which is cursed, which ultimately curses him. And again, we'll see when we look later in a few months' time at Beowulf that we're going to see a cursed treasure there as well. But there is a sense here that that is avoided by the right choice of Giles in kind of taking this bargain. So they set off, right? The dragon is left looking like a moving van, right? We have another kind of comical image portrayed there. And we get so earlier there had been this, the person had indicated he should take this rope along, right? And it was unclear why. So he's using it to tie down the treasure. And then along the way, we also start to see the shift in the kind of power bases in the story. So Giles is accumulating followers. Um, right? He's eventually going to get the dozen likely lads. That is to say, lads that are likely in the sense that they're promising, right? They show that they're going to be, they can make something of themselves. So they're chosen by Giles to follow him. It's the beginning of him creating his own retinue. So meanwhile, we get the the scene at the castle where everyone's in mourning, right? Most of the knights have been killed. Many more probably assumed dead, and Giles indeed is assumed dead. We even learn that a dirge, that's a kind of a sad song of mourning, has already been commanded by the king to be sung for Giles. When they learn that, joyously, so it seems, he has survived and come back with the treasure. However, the king is most displeased to learn that Giles refuses to come to him with the treasure or indeed at all. So we have this description of Giles as it says, Farmer Giles had now become more than the hero of the countryside, though he was certainly already that. He was the darling of the land, and folk did not cheer the knights and men at arms as they went by, though they still took off their hats to the king. As he drew nearer to Ham, that's the king, the looks grew more sullen. In some villages, the people shut their doors and not a face could be seen. So we get a sense here of again a shift in power, right? So one, Giles is described as the darling of the land. Now, historically speaking, in terms of real historical people, that title, at least in literature and the legends about them, was applied to King Alfred the Great of England, who defended England against the Vikings, and to a character called Hereward the Wake, who was a kind of rebel who held out against the Norman conquest. So it's being applied to Giles, but of course, Giles maybe is closer to Hereward the Wake than he is to King Alfred, right? There's a sense that, again, just like we've seen the knights as kind of being good for nothing so far, and right, the farmer Giles, the yeoman, having to step up and take their place. We see more of that, but it seems that now he's even replacing the king, although at least people still take their hat off to the king. So we get the confrontation then between the king and Farmer Giles, where Farmer Giles makes no ifs, ands, or buts about the fact that he's not about to listen to the king, regardless of what he says. And this argument goes back and forth, but the real turning point, again, if you want to think about language, is the royal we. And the shift there is probably a kind of symbolic, in terms of language, shift in the power. So you may have heard of the royal we. The idea is that the monarch as a representative of the crown and of the people, a kind of the symbolic head of the entire nation, um, will sometimes use the plural we when referring to themselves. So the famous example is Queen Victoria, right, historically saying, "We are not amused." The king uses the royal we. We've seen it, but he forgets finally at the point where he's demanding that Giles turn over Tailbiter, and he says, "Give me my sword," shouted the king, finding his voice, but forgetting his plural. "Give us your crown," said Giles, a staggering remark, such as never been heard in all the days of the Middle Kingdom. Right? So there's a sense that not only does the king forget to use his royal we, but Giles, in adopting it, right, is really representing his, even though he's not calling himself king yet, right, he's kind of taking on these royal trappings. And of course, he is able to do this because under the bridge he has the dragon as beck and call. And indeed, it's probably the only time in the text that we get the dragon really represented as great and terrible. Right? It says, just at that moment the dragon got up from the bridge. He had lain there concealed under the far bank, deep in the river. Now he let off a terrible steam, for he had drunk many gallons of water. At once there was a thick fog, and only the red eyes of the dragon to be seen in it. "Go home, you fools," he bellowed, "or I will tear you to pieces. There are knights lying cold in the mountain pass, and soon there will be more in the river. All the king's horses and all the king's men," he roared. Right? So again, all the king's horses, all the king's men, right? reference to Humpty Dumpty. So it's still playing with, even though here we have a more kind of dramatic type fairy tale scene in terms of the dragon bellowing. It's still having fun with the fairy tale element, right? By referring to this nursery rhyme. All the king's horses, all the king's men, right? They're not going to help the king this time. So the king is ultimately forced to yield to Farmer Giles. And Farmer Giles himself gets immortalized in poems. And we've seen a lot of this. We looked at it in The Cave of Kai, for instance, this idea of right, living on through song, and specifically through sung poetry, right? And so we get this poem, The Battle of the Bridge, which is the kind of non-battle between the king and Farmer Giles, right? And it says written in mock heroic couplets. So, so a heroic couplet is a particular form of verse, right? That is in couplets, and is usually used for heroic material. We also have something called mock heroic poetry, which is you see Chaucer or some people like that use. So here we have something again, assumedly a mockish version of the traditional heroic form, which properly represents the whole tale, because in many ways it is a kind of traditional heroic tale. Right, the hero overcomes the dragon, right? Eventually, becomes lord of the land, but of course, it's not done in a serious fashion. And Giles keeps the dragon. He keeps him in the tithe barn. The tithe barn is the barn where 1/10 of all the grain would go for maintaining the religious houses. So that's where the dragon is. And he becomes the Lord of Tame, which again is a mock etymology for a real place name, but of course not the real, or at least not the historical story. Anyway, he still pays tribute to the king, right? But it's comically insignificant, right? There's this sense that he still paid a nominal tribute to the king, 6 ox tails and a pint of bitter delivered on St. Matthias's Day, that being the date of the meeting on the bridge. So on February 24th, St. Matthias's Day, when they had this battle on the bridge, he sends him this, right, pitifully small amount of tribute. But for all intents and purposes, right, he's no longer under the king's control. Right, he advances his title from lord to earl, and right, we get the sense that as his waistline advances, so do his titles. Right, again, another very comic image. And we even get this group of knights that he forms, the Worm Wardens, right? It says so thus Giles became at length old and venerable, and had a white beard down to his knees in a very respectable court, in which merit was often rewarded. Assumedly, that is quite different from the king's court. And an entirely new order of knighthood. These were the Worm Wardens. The dragon was their ensign. The 12 likely lads were the senior members. So, again, worm-eating dragons, so the guardians of the dragon. And it's a kind of comical version of the Knights of the Round Table, right? They even have the dragon as it's a traditional ensign, but not exactly a traditional order of knighthood. So we get the conclusions for the miller and blacksmith character. The blacksmith gives up blacksmithing. The miller becomes, right, a fawning, obsequious servant to King Giles, as he eventually starts calling himself. And of course, we get some more comical etymologies, right? There's right, a joke on the incongruity of Thames being pronounced Thames. So the river Thames in England, of course, is spelled with a TH, right? We get some jokes about that. But ultimately, right, everything turns out in the end. The wormings become great, right? Worming Hall becomes a great site. And again, it's important to note the kind of tale that Tolkien is telling here, right? He's placing this very much in the history of the place where he lived, around Oxford. Right, inventing his grand history, where now these little places around where he lived have now become, an ancient royal seat. He even makes references to Tailbiter the sword being, apparently buried off somewhere. And in the end, the dragon goes off into Wales, and Farmer Giles, right, is king. It says, the face of the land has changed since that time, and kingdoms have come and gone, woods have fallen, and rivers have shifted, and only the hills remain. And they are worn down by the rain and the wind. But still that name endures, though men now call it Wunnel, or so I'm told, for villages have fallen from their pride. But in the days of which this tale speaks, Worming Hall it was, and a royal seat, and the dragon's standard flew above the trees, and all things went well there and merrily, while Tailbiter was above ground. So we get this, great conclusion, right? Farmer Giles has succeeded beyond perhaps his own wildest dreams. But it might be worth asking, what kind of a hero is Farmer Giles? Or perhaps I should say King Giles of Ham. Does the fact that he is the hero of a humorous story, right, a kind of satirical story, does that change the way in which we see his heroism? Right? Is a satirical or a humorous heroism different from the serious kind? And what about his reliance on luck? Does that undercut his own courage? It's worth keeping in mind when we look at more serious stories later, like Beowulf, who too must fight a dragon. But I would like to leave you with the ending of the story in the first manuscript version, before it was revised, back when it was still more explicitly for children, um, and it became less oral. This is the way Tolkien originally ended the story. But who was the real hero of the story, do you suppose? Said Daddy. I don't know. The Grey Mare, of course, he said. And that ended it.